types of immigrants that are coming into the United States and some of the reasons why people are immigrating. So, when looking at Hispanics and Latinas in the United States, we see that they come from different national origins and they have a wide variety of experiences. That's why there's going to be a variety of cultural differences depending on where these populations originally came from. So, most of the Hispanic population in the United States is from Mexico or Spanish speaking parts of Central and South America. And the three main groups that have immigrated here are Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. So there's going to be a large population of Puerto Ricans in New York just because of the location of where they're from, right? It's closer and easier for them to kind of settle down in New York. And there is a larger Cuban population in Florida, again, because of where they're located. A majority of unauthorized immigrants in the US do come from Mexico. But it is important to note that the number is falling while authorized immigrants is rising. So if we take a look at this graph, we see that if we're looking at the unauthorized immigrant population, there is this decline that takes place since its peak in 2007. So it isn't a substantial decline yet, but it is still noticeable. And in dealing with these different immigrant populations, there are different methods that people think that immigrants should take. So the first is assimilation, and the second is this idea of a melting pot. We've already gone over these concepts before and when we talked about culture and society, so I'm not going to repeat them again. If you have any questions about it, feel free to email me. There's also two different types. So if we look at pluralism, we see ethnic cultures keep their separate cultural identities, yet share equality in rights and citizenship. And in pluralism, there is a dominant culture. And that is what makes it subtly different from multiculturalism. So they are very similar, and multiculturalism is an outgrowth of pluralism, but they're not the same thing. So in multiculturalism, ethnic groups exist separately and equally. And they lack the requirement of a dominant culture. So all minority groups have equal status with the majority. The key difference is the distribution of power in economic and political life among ethnic groups. That's why if we look at the United States, they are closer to pluralism. There is a nationalist culture. We have, this underlying ideology, and that does cause there to be a dominant culture. Whereas a more multicultural society would be a place like Switzerland. So there are separate groups, but they're equally powerful. And these separate groups are the French, Germans, and Italian ethnic groups. Immigration, broadly defined, is the movement of people into one country from another for the purpose of settlement. And immigration is just when people leave one country to settle in another. So immigration is when they're coming in, immigration is when they're leaving. And so Castiles and Miller looked at these global migration patterns, and they found that there are four tendencies to categorize these new patterns of migration. The first one was acceleration. So there are greater numbers of migration across borders if we're looking at this historically. There's also diversification. So immigrants are from different backgrounds. There's a greater variety of immigrants. Most of them are not just coming from Europe. Globalization causes a greater number of countries involved in sending and receiving people. So, nation states are highly connected, it does allow more people to come and go at times easier rate. And feminization is the growing number of migrants are women. So if we're looking at previous populations, we do see that there are more women migrating, and that is specifically in the roles of domestic workers, sex trafficking, and mail order brides. So a kind of old school way to look at the causes for migration are looking at different push and pull factors. So some of the pull factors are the dynamics that force people to immigrate. It's forcing them to leave the nation state that they're originally from. And some influences of this are war, famine, political oppression. And pull factors are factors that attract immigrants to different countries. So some potential things that are going to attract immigrants are the labor market, if there's more of a demand for work in a certain nation state compared to another. There's better living conditions. A lot of the time people want to immigrate into the United States because of these better living conditions and more political freedoms. So if you're living in a very oppressive regime, if you're living in a place that has a dictatorship or an authoritarian leader, you're likely to want to leave and go to a place that is considered more democratic and will allow you more freedoms. But it's not as simple as just looking at these push and pull factors. We do find that the causes for migration are more complex, and they're influenced by the interaction between multiple factors. So if we look at macro level factors, we see that laws and regulations controlling immigration and changes in the international economy are some of the macro level factors that are going to influence immigration. Obviously, if there are laws that are restricting you from immigrating, you're not going to be able to, despite any of the factors that are kind of motivating you to leave. It's going to be very restrictive. And changes in the international economy, that can cause that even if the quality of life where someone is living is very low, and that these potential changes could make it so it's not as substantially different for them if they move to another region. Whereas the micro level processes affecting migration are resources available. So if they're getting, if they have remittances that they're sending home to their family members, if, after a while their family members has enough money and they're able to come to the United States or, a more developed country, that is going to be influential. Just having the resources to do it in general. And also the knowledge received from friends and family networks. So if your friends and family are already in one of these countries, you're going to have a lot more insight into your ability to leave. Another major reason that causes migration is a diaspora. So this is the dispersal of an ethnic population from an original homeland into foreign areas. And they're often forced in a manner or under traumatic circumstances. So this isn't so much people deciding that they would like to migrate. And these groups are thought of as victims. So if we think of Africans who were forced into slavery, they're going to fall into this category. And if we think of Jews that were forced from their homes out of terror due to the Nazi regime, they're going to fall into the category of a diaspora. So they all have something in common, even though they're coming from parts of the world that are dramatically different. First, people leave their homeland out of force or voluntarily. They share a common memory about and belief in returning to their homeland. So even though they have left because of these harsh conditions, they still have this view that they would like to get back there someday, once the conditions have improved. their ethnic identity is sustained over time and distance. So they're not, likely to really assimilate into a dominant culture or anything like that. They're going to hold on to their identity because that's something that kind of, reminds them of where they started. They feel a strong sense of solidarity with other ethnic group members, even those settling elsewhere as part of the diaspora. So because, they've all had to leave because of these bad conditions, they do feel a sense of solidarity with each other because they can relate to each other because of that experience. And there is some tension they experience where they settle. So, because there are populations that have new cultural identities and things that the settled population hasn't really been exposed to before, there is going to be a little bit of tension there. And they have the potential to make valuable contributions to their host societies. So they do have, skills that they can contribute to the workforce there. More generally, some information about immigration, some changes that have taken place. So if we look in 2012, more than 40 million foreign-born individuals in the United States. That is 13% of the total population. And we haven't seen a number like that since the 1920s. But there is this shift in demographic. So in the 1880s and 1890s, most immigrants admitted to the U.S. were from European origin. In the 1980s and 1990s, however, fewer than 10% of immigrants admitted into the U.S. were of European origin. So there are these dramatic cultural differences. Between 1989 and 1993, more than half came from Mexico, the Philippines, Vietnam, and El Salvador. And the United States has altered its immigration policy multiple times to encourage or discourage certain groups of people from coming to the United States. So, depending on different historical periods, there were, acts that excluded immigrants from coming, and there are acts that made it easier for them. So this is influenced by changes in the workforce and changes in cultural attitudes that people have at certain times. And this causes a lot of debates about immigration to take place. And these debates are centered around securing employment and achieving economic self-sufficiency. So the people who are against immigration say that the people who are immigrating into the United States are lower skilled immigrants with less education. And from this view, that causes them to be reliant on government assistance. They see large-scale migration of less skilled workers as being harmful to the economic opportunities of less skilled natives. So it's not just that they're going to be relying on government assistance. They do see this having a negative effect because there's this increase in the number of workers, which is going to create more competition in the labor market. And they do talk about this in the context of African American workers. So they're kind of associating them with these lower wage jobs and saying that if they're going to be competing with these new immigrant populations, it is going to be harmful for them. Something that kind of builds off these anti-immigrant stance and some of the problems that could potentially arise due to immigration is scapegoating. So this is when people or groups are blamed for problems that are not their fault. And this does shape relationships and race and ethnicity. So immigrants are often blamed for unemployment, even though they don't have control over economic policy, right? They don't have control over large economic changes that are influenced by fluctuations in the market and fluctuations in the production process. And this kind of scapegoating is expressed through lines such as they took our jobs, this idea that they're taking jobs from American workers. It's also related to the Trump rhetoric about crime and availability of drugs. So this quote demonstrates that nicely. The idea that they're bringing drugs, they bring crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. If we focus on the two beginning lines here, we see that it's a lot easier to blame drug problems and crime problems on immigrant populations rather than, looking at these issues as a society and trying to figure out how we can put different policies through that will kind of help these issues that we're dealing with. So that's kind of the convenience of scapegoating. It gets people away from dealing with these larger structural problems. On the other side of this debate, there are people who support immigration, and they argue that immigrants benefit the U.S. economy by joining the labor force and paying into the Federal Reserve System. So this approach assumes that immigrants earn the same wages and are as employable as natives. It's not taking on this assumption that they're low-skilled workers that are going to need the support of the government. There's also this idea that they're cultural assets, so there's more potential to bring in innovators and problem solvers rather than just low-skilled workers. And the National Immigration Forum found that immigrant workers contribute significantly to the national economy. Even though most immigrants do work in low-wage and hard labor jobs, without them, the gross domestic product of the United States would be around $1 trillion less than it is. So that is a good reason to have these laborers, even if they are low-skilled. But assessing the fiscal costs of immigration is difficult because stats about immigration are hard. Stats about immigration and immigrants are hard to find. So if you're immigrating to a country illegally, obviously it's going to be a little bit difficult to obtain data. There's a lot of information out there, and it's all based on, what data they were able to access and kind of figure out the benefits and disadvantages of immigration. And something that is really important when we're looking at immigrants and the kind of jobs that they're working is farming and the regulations that are put on immigrants. So farming uses a higher percentage of illegal labor than any other U.S. industry. This industry really, really benefits off, the labor of illegal immigrants. And immigrants working illegally in this country accounted for about 46% of America's roughly 800,000 crop farm workers in recent years. And if we look at a case of, farming and regulations about immigrants, we see after 2011, it did become a felony to use false documentation to apply for a job in Georgia. And one controversial aspect of their immigration law is there was this requirement that law enforcement officers check the immigration status of suspects with who cannot provide their identification upon request. And this is usually dealt with at the federal level. That's why that did become a little problematic for some people. And if we look at this interview from farmer Gary Polk, he discussed how he had a good yield of blueberries, but he did not have the laborers to pick them, so they ended up rotting. He says this is a healthy field and it should have been picked, but there's nobody here. So despite the bad economy, Americans don't really want to work these farm jobs. We see that when we put these regulations on illegal workers, and there is this opportunity for people in the United States to take these jobs, they most likely don't. In most instances, they don't. And then the farmer and the crops are the ones that are suffering. So this immigration policy in Georgia caused many Mexican and Guatemalan pickers to kind of stay away from the area because they were scared about the new crackdown on illegal immigration. And if we look at some of the new rhetoric and new potential policies towards farming and immigration, Donald Trump's hardline stance on immigration does cause farmers to fear that there will be a crackdown on their workers. So we saw what happened in Georgia. Now that kind of thinking has extended nationally because of this kind of rhetoric that we're going to be very tough on, the regulations that are put in place towards immigrants and the access that they have to come to the United States. So in response to that, fruit and vegetable growers, dairy and cattle farmers, and owners of plant nurseries and vineyards are lobbying for politicians to get a deal to deal with immigration in a different way. They don't see the crackdown as being beneficial to their business. And if America's unauthorized labor force shrank 40%, this is just a hypothetical, vegetable production could drop by more than 4%. So that gives you an idea of how nationally this can be very harmful. And the American Farm Bureau Federation said that strict immigration enforcement would raise food prices 5 to 6%. So not only would there be kind of this shortage, but that shortage would cause these prices to go up for consumers. So that's why a drop in supply and could cause farmers to face higher labor costs. So because there's a shortage in fruits and vegetables in the first place, and then a shortage in workers, that's overall going to cause food prices to increase.